Snappy New Year, y'all. Let's take a look at the best cards, the best decks, all of those things from 2025. Welcome to the Golden Cubes. Now, what I have done is curated several categories, and we're doing this a bit like a Marvel Snap Awards show. The way I plan on doing it, you will be able to vote on the winner in the comments. The nominees all come from me, as do the categories. Let's start with what I think is a really competitive category. This category is Best Buff. Nominee number one is War Machine. War Machine going to 5/9 was an inarguable huge buff for the archetype of Electro Ramp because it curves so well with a turn 3 Electro that people were already playing it to mitigate the downside. It just became a card that fit much better. This nerf also has the upside of getting rid of a dangerously annoying combo, Storm War Machine Legion. So on multiple levels, this is a true contender. Captain Carter was released as a 4-cost and was totally unplayable. As a 3-cost, she is a very solid card, not overpowered, not underpowered, a constant companion to Silver Surfer Brood decks, a powerful enough card that does interesting enough things, but generally speaking, a balanced and strong contributor to her archetypes that didn't go overboard. This was one of the few season passes they buffed during the season, and I think inarguably it improved the experience of anyone playing this card. Zombie Giant Man, which is almost a shorthand for all of the buffs they gave to the zombie package, which is really what a season like that needed. I think this one makes it on the list largely, and the best argument for it is that this is them recognizing what it takes to be a 5-drop in the modern era of Marvel Snap. That is what this buff is getting credit for. It made Zombie Giant Man actually legitimately playable, both in the mid-range archetype and in the Jet Phoenix Force archetype. Adding the power to this card is them understanding that they ended up aiming low for what Marvel Snap is nowadays, and corrected that. I wouldn't even say overcorrected it. They just correctly corrected it. This is one of those buffs where they just put it in the exact right spot for this to be an exciting, interesting, and powerful card that isn't busted. And I think they did a really good job of that. Finally, Kang the Conqueror going from a 5/0 unplayable card to a 3/4 like minorly unplayable card. That is the biggest argument here, is that just that Kang is a card you'll actually see people play sometimes. Not a deck unto himself, but you will see people play him. And I think that is an important and reasonable thing to argue for. I think it's a solid piece of what Kang is. And I think just Kang generally not being this wildly, like, I would argue overall, I think you can make a very coherent argument that old Kang was the worst card in the game. It made games longer, which is fundamentally a bad thing. It generally took away from the appeal of Snap with its overlong animation. It didn't really do anything good. It was a bad card that when you played, it also made your game experience worse. Sometimes it would crash the game. All sorts of stuff that card did. One of the worst cards in the game in terms of winning games and also in terms of design. Now it is a card that is much more functional in terms of both of those things. Debris makes it on the best nerf nominees, largely on the strength of how hated her archetype was. I know there are going to be people who are in the comments who disagree with all of these. I get that. That's how people work. There's going to be some differing opinions out there. But I think largely Clog is a deck that is not something people enjoy playing against. The dynamics of Marvel Snap are very weird when it comes to snaps and a Clog deck that isn't a particularly fun thing to do. Generally, I think people don't like being told they can't do things in the game, and Clog is a #1 offender here. Debris going from that to being a card that I've actually still seen some reasonable amounts of play with this card. Getting her out of her niche of being a Clog card and into a more interesting niche of a potential downside big body card, I think does a lot for her. A bit of an also ran, potentially. I think if Enchantress wins this category, I don't really see a path to victory for her, but she does deserve to be nominated. You know what they say, it's an honor just to be nominated. I think largely, though, she gets wrapped up in the Shang-Chi of it all, and I think that if a tech card getting nerfed is going to win this category, it's probably going to be Shang-Chi, but who knows? The voters, you could decide otherwise. This is a card that is just a more interesting card at a bigger body with a bigger cost. This is a card that is now a meaningful inclusion in Electro decks. Again, we talked about War Machine going to 5. I don't think people have talked about Enchantress going to 5 as a meaningful mitigator on Electro, but it also matters in those decks. It is a less easily splashable card, which changes the tenor of how ongoing decks interact with the metagame, and generally probably is a good thing the more ongoing effects they make. I think that this is just a very, very good change that in a less stacked category could easily have won. This guy was ridiculous at 3 cost and is still extremely powerful at 4 cost. In fact, I think the only argument that this couldn't be one of the best nerfs is that he might still need to be nerfed again. But just addressing this guy was a huge win for Marvel Snap generally. A big, big, big improvement in the dynamism of endgames. There was a period towards the middle of the year where every deck was just Juggernaut Negasonic slop, and I know that Negasonic could have an argument to be on here, but to me, talking about Negasonic when we're talking about Shang-Chi and Juggernaut and things like that, it's a bit like potential, man. Like, it's like saying you need to talk about Megumi Fushiguro in a conversation about Gojo and Yuta. It's not the same thing. The genre is similar, but they're not the same thing. The next category is Worst Buff. Now, this is a bit of a, I guess, questionable category because it is a little subjective, but that's an awards show, right? So the idea here is we want cards that got buffed and just generally made things worse. So we're going to start out with, I think, an easy contender when they buffed Misery to 4/9. What was that? Why'd they do it? She's not a 4/9 anymore. That's because it was a bad idea to make her a 4/9 in the first place. And it was pretty apparent that it was a bad idea to make her a 4/9 in the first place. Pretty solid contender for worst buff. Cerebro. I mean, it's cool. This Cerebro's like a good deck now. Like that's cool. It's nice. It's cute. But the play patterns of the deck are very unfun and generally involve, boy, I really hope they get unlucky in terms of either not drawing their 1-win condition, which is the card Cerebro, or in terms of some kind of location preventing them from working. The deck's a balanced deck. It's just that the wins are all lopsided and then the losses are all lopsided, and it doesn't really add up into a good feeling kind of situation. Pretty reasonable argument for worst buff in this category. You know, I'm realizing I might have introduced this category as worst nerf, and you're just going to have to live with that. I don't know if I did, and I'm not going to rewatch this to find out. That's up to you guys. It's a mystery. This one falls in the misery category of like a buff that happened to a card that didn't need it, and then it got reverted because the card didn't need it. Remember when they made Mobius M. Mobius a 3/4? Yeah, I remember that too. I was confused then. I'm confused now. I don't know what, like... It's a very weird decision to do this. Like, I get it. Okay, we got, Surge and Mr. Fantastic running around. He doesn't help against those cards in a meaningful way. Like, last year they did this thing where it was like, let's see if we can control Agent Venom by making Shadow King better. And they couldn't, and it was bad. But at least that one made more sense. This one makes way less sense. This is just like, I don't see it here. And what you're going to do is just sort of make this card generically playable, and this card generally makes the game less fun when it's generically playable. Mobius and Mobius to 3/4, you are a potential Golden Cube winner. Honest to God, I have no idea where to put Ghost in this whole setup. Like, what do I do with Ghost? Does this go in best, or like worst buff? Does it go in worst nerf? How would you categorize this? I've decided to put it in worst buff, right? This is just, they thought they were doing something, they weren't doing it, it doesn't work. This card does not work to counter end of turn cards. What would need to happen for it to be an end of turn counter is for it to be an ongoing effect, but as we'll talk about in the bugs section of this video, I'm pretty sure if they made this an ongoing effect, it would crash the game somehow. I don't know exactly how, but I'm pretty sure it will work that way. Into the category of worst nerf. Now, these are nerfs that are widely agreed upon to be bad for one reason or another, and those reasons are going to be the important thing here. We're starting with Mr. Fantastic First Steps, who I think got a little bit over smashed in the face here for what he was to what he is. Now, I do think that this is maybe grading on a curve because he was so good that it became his identity that he is so good. And so nerfing him, taking him out of that space means that in a way it is a betrayal of his identity, even though it's not fair to look at it that way. Functionally, that is how it felt. This card's identity was, this is the best card in the game. It goes in a bunch of different stuff. Everything revolves around him, and he became a sort of fringe bit player. That's not what his identity was supposed to be, but he was so good that that is what it became. And so I think it's almost a little unfair for this to be in here because I think they probably made the right decision. Maybe he should have been a 3-5, but I think mostly they did the right thing with this card. It's just, I think a lot of people felt very betrayed by that sort of identity confusion, which, again, not anyone's fault. It's just how things go sometimes. Another one where you're like, does this go in worst buff category or worst nerf? This is a confusing one, but we put it in worst nerf because this is just an absolute nerf to what Morgan Le Fay does. Where I think you could argue about Ghost, this card got nerfed. This card is worse now, and largely it's worse because a Morgan deck is totalizing. When people play Morgan decks, they play about this card, and when it is a 4-cost card, you are able to interact with it with things like Airwalker, and that allows it to be a more consistent deck when it's built around one card. What this did is sort of force Morgan into a supporting role in other decks. You see her in like some Phantom X stuff, for example. And it's cool, but it did take away an archetype from the game. That archetype does not function if you don't have another way to go out and get your Morgan Le Fay. And so it just doesn't function. Storm to 3-1, worst nerf nominee, but I do have a little bit of grace for this because I realize it's like, okay, we got to address Storm, War Machine, Legion. War Machine addressing it in that way was just a way better decision than any of the Storm stuff. But fundamentally, like, Storm puts you in an awkward spot because she's a bit like old Spider-Man, which if you recall old Spider-Man, the one that got rid of locations, she's an incredibly popular, dynamic, and interesting character for which there can be a bunch of different interpretations. And I think having her interpretation in this game be, you can't play here, is doing a disservice to her in terms of her own enjoyability. There is probably a cool and interesting and powerful and flavorful Storm that you could do. It's especially a little bit awkward in the context of who she is as a character, a sort of representative of freedom, where like I think you could look at Professor X and say, actually, him locking down, that's pretty in character. I'd argue that's more in character than it is for Storm. I think that largely what this speaks to isn't so much that Storm got the short end of the stick on the nerfs because of the Storm War Machine Legion thing. I think it just speaks to a general design that I wouldn't want to keep on Storm long term. Our last nominee for worst nerf is Colleen Wing going to 2-3, a totally pointless nerf that took away a fairly interesting card in a fairly okay archetype for absolutely no reason that happened exactly before they decided actually 2-4 is the new vanilla. And so not only did this card get nerfed to a sub-vanilla stat line, everyone realized it was just totally fine the entire time. I don't know what this nerf was at the time. I don't know what this nerf is now. You should make her a 2-4 again. The next category is Worst Series 5 Card of the Year. Nominee number 1, Zombie Galacti. Guy came right out and went straight to the bottom of the tier list. Yes, he is a 7-5 now. I'm choosing to base these on what they are as their stats when they came out. One of the worst cards that has ever been released. Bad, 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 bad. I can only say so many things about the clunkiness of this card. However, an argument against it is that in the back of my mind, like, you could play this card. Like, it's not the worst thing you've ever done, especially at 7-5. Like, I think there's things that can make you want to do this, and it's like a bad archetype, but I think it is sort of overstated in how bad it is because of how bad it was on day one when nobody could understand how to build the deck, and so everyone's playing bad versions of a bad deck, and you can actually play a good version of a bad deck, and it'll be, like, quasi-playable. That's sort of where we are now with the card, but largely I would say this is a very deserving nominee. Thaddeus Ross, he does basically nothing. He has almost always done basically nothing. There was a little bit where people would play him in hella decks. He was probably wrong to be doing then, looking back at it. Obviously, we didn't know that at the time, but like, look back at it, you could probably be like, yeah, that was probably a mistake. Completely terrible card. No redeeming qualities. Generally abysmal. Zombie Captain Marvel, I think, is a little miscast. I think this is a card that's not like totally abysmally terrible, but there's a sort of combination of complexity and badness here that I think is really worth diving into as like, okay, here's why this card actually does deserve to be here. Because on the merits, I think this is like a pretty mediocre card. It's not like especially bad. You could play it in bad mid-range decks or even in relatively okay mid-range decks and not be that mad about it. The problem with this card is the complexity and the way the wording on it interacts with priority on final turns of games is deeply non-intuitive. Or maybe it's intuitive to a Marvel Snap gamer, but if you showed this to a normal person, you were like, why didn't this happen? Like, there's just so much baked into this. The fact that this is a Captain Marvel riff that doesn't work like Captain Marvel, but it doesn't work like Captain Marvel only in ways that hurt you. Just all of the things this card does are sort of complex and weird and work at about 60% of the capacity you'd intuitively expect. None of that is a recipe for a good card. Look, I'll be honest, I didn't have a fourth nominee for this category, so we counted up all of the cards that have been released into Series 5 in 2025. There were 69 of them, nice. And then I ran a random number generator to give me the number of a card that I would just slap onto this category on the theory that, as my Discord is so fond of saying, every card that came out in 2025 is irredeemable garbage. Now, this isn't true, but it did roll Red Wing. And so I'm going to make an argument for Red Wing being an actual nominee here because I have an incredible ability to talk extemporaneously about things and also nothing but time on my hands. So Red Wing deserves to be on here because every single Red Wing deck is a bad version of a different, better archetype. There has never been a Red Wing deck that is actually the best at doing what it's trying to do. It is halfway between a ramp deck and a Hella deck. It is worse than both in almost every situation because of the way this card demands you build your deck with either a comical level of consistency for actually making Red Wing good, or making it actually happen in the first place. The best thing Red Wing has ever done is get people to play Ghost Spider in their already reasonable ramp decks. Full stop. This card is a poor man's Chamber. It has done what Chamber has done for the ramp archetype is so much dramatically better than what Red Wing was ever capable of. People may talk about Dracula Dump. That's cool. That's nice. I'm proud of you. It is a tier 2.5, tier 3 deck. That is also every Red Wing deck. I don't have any graphics for worst bug, but the nominees are Infinite Matchmaking generally. It's been pretty bad in 2025. Stardust Mysterio, perhaps the most foreseeable bug of all time. Stardust comes out, you play Mysterio, and the game instantly crashes. I saw people playing Mysterio, of course by people I mean Danish, in Hella to crash the game in order to prevent their losses to Mysterio. Wonderful game. Notifications not clearing, constant problem in Marvel Snap, pretty consistently going to show up in lists like this. And of course, the blip, which frankly I expect to be a runaway winner. I mean, honestly, how can you beat Marvel Snap being banned in America because it was owned by a subsidiary of the company that owns TikTok, and they were doing what seems at this point to be like a half PR stunt in order to curry favor with the incoming administration? Very cool, very awesome, super dope that impacted the dumbass game I play on my phone. The next category is Deck of the Year. This is for the deck that best represents 2025 to you. The nominees are Victoria Hand, for being perhaps the most consistent deck across the entirety of the year. In fact, I believe she was the first card released into Series 5 in the year, and this has been, in many ways, the year of Victoria Hand. From start to finish, she has been part of the metagame, sometimes at the top, very often in the top 5, a consistent performer who has been there every waking moment of Marvel Snap. Without doing much in the first half of the year, Cerebro really came on after the All-Star break, allowing Zapgaze to win the Golden Gauntlet World Championship with a deck that many people agreed was pretty not good before anything happened to it. Now, it was on some performance-enhancing OTAs. It's interesting to see whether or not that will be something the voters take into account. Move could be a very reasonable choice for deck of the year. I think it's probably, if you ask the designers, the deck that caused them the most headache over the course of the year, where Victoria Hand was the sort of consistent performer that was pretty good, pretty bad, just generally around. Move has this unique skill curve where it is obscenely powerful at high levels and very mediocre at low levels, which makes it very difficult to make cards for. I think that this is just an example of a card. Like when you look at the card I have on the screen here, Madam Web, I'm personally shocked this card even exists still. And I think it's, there's like, you design around it. There's like a Human Torch stuff that has been happening in recent weeks to like make this a less of a ridiculous thing to exist. But generally speaking, Move is and has been, I think I would argue Move's highs were significantly higher than Victoria Hand's highs, except as we get into the very most recent few months. And Move's lows were probably about the same amount of low. 34 card Monty is our final nominee for deck of the year. And I gotta tell you, I'm a little afraid people are just gonna vote for this one because it's funny. And it would be funny for 34 card Monty to be the deck of the year. I do think it probably has the weakest case of these as deck of the year, but in a way on the internet, that is the strongest case because voting for things because they'd be funny. It's the lesson of Bodie McBoatface. Sometimes things like that just happen. I think this is a deck that it's been around, but really kind of fell off being a deck when they nerfed Thanos. And that was like a full 6 months of the year where it was just not really that good. I don't know that I would consider it a serious contender here, but the voters will make their own decisions. Last up is Season Pass of the Year. Iron Patriot got nerfed and is still and has been a staple for the entire year. Consistently powerful, consistently showing up in decks, from mid-range decks to decks that actually use the synergy that it has with created cards. A lot of Iron Patriots are showing up. Nerfed multiple times, Sam Wilson, Season Pass of the Year, a very real contender here, arguably the strongest Season Pass I think that they made this entire year. I think it's very clear to me that this is the guy if you're going on release power, but I don't know that that's what the voters will go for. Merlin, I would think, is a runaway favorite in terms of what a season pass would be the way I would phrase it, but I think he's honestly, if I really zoom out, maybe a little bit strong. Like, this is a very powerful card that has been very powerful since he came out. Is it good that that is what a season pass is? I think this is the kind of thing that could be litigated in this conversation, especially as we compare Merlin to the final nominee. Because to me, the biggest difference between Merlin and Agamotto is that Merlin is a 5-star card and Agamotto is a 3.5 to 4-star card. Merlin is an all-star in elite decks, and Agamotto is a good build-around in some okay decks. They're otherwise fairly similar, and I think that that is notable because to me, if I'm the designers, I would prefer making an Agamotto 10 out of 10 times because there's not really the risk that he's going to be super duper insanely busted. He's going to be a good card, and that's what you really want. But if you're a player, don't you really prefer a Merlin? Wouldn't you really like a card that's just been amazing ever since you got it and never had to get nerfed, even though, if we're really honest, it's probably like a point of power over where it's supposed to be? I think that this kind of dichotomy, to me, these are the contenders for the award. All right, y'all, the voting should be set up in the comments. There's going to be a separate comment for each category. Under each of those comments will be the nominees for that category. You can vote with the little thumbs up button. I might also at some point put a poll elsewhere, maybe on the YouTube community page or on Twitter or something like that. And I will eventually tally all the votes and talk about the winners and the cases. Also, feel free to make cases this in the comments. I want you guys arguing this and hashing it out and seeing what kind of consensus we can draw. Some of those comments will almost certainly make it in to that video that I do on this. So thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.